I have presided over hundreds of cases, fraud, assault, corporate deception, even murder trials that left permanent silence in my courtroom. But this case titled, Kara mocked a well-known TV judge's accent 47 seconds later. She was crying in court, still disturbs me more than I care to admit. Because what happened in those opening moments was not just disrespect, it was psychological collapse unfolding in real time in front of a full courtroom. And I was the one sitting on the bench when it happened. I still remember that morning with unusual clarity. The courtroom was already full before I even entered. That alone is never a good sign. When people arrive early like that, it usually means they are expecting entertainment, not justice. The defendant sat at my left, Karen Mitchell, mid-30s. Composed posture, the kind of calm that experienced judges learn to distrust immediately. Not because calm is suspicious, but because rehearsed calm often hides something volatile underneath. Across from her sat the plaintiff, Emily Dawson, a young woman with trembling hands she kept trying to hide under the table. I've seen that type of fear before, when someone is not afraid of the courtroom itself, but of the person sitting across from them. The prosecutor, Michael Reeves, organized his files with precision. I could tell he had prepared thoroughly. But even he seemed slightly uneasy, like he knew this case was going to behave differently than normal legal disputes. And then there was the jury. They weren't just observing, they were anticipating something. That's the dangerous part of modern trials. People don't always come for truth anymore. Sometimes they come for moments. I called the court to order, and that's when I noticed something I still can't forget. Karen Mitchell was smiling, not nervously, not politely, but with the faintest expression of amusement, as if she already knew how this entire situation would unfold. In my years on the bench, I learned something important. People who smile too early in a trial usually believe they are the smartest person in the room, or they think everyone else is about to be humiliated. The prosecutor began opening statements, laying out what appeared to be a civil harassment and defamation case. According to Emily Dawson, Karen had repeatedly mocked her in public, escalated personal humiliation online, and pushed it into real-world consequences that affected her job and reputation. But what caught my attention wasn't just the allegations, it was what triggered the emotional breakdown that led us here, a viral video. A clip where Karen Mitchell was allegedly seen mocking the accent of a well-known television judge during a public commentary stream. The courtroom projector was ready but not yet activated, and I remember thinking, this is going to go wrong in ways no one is expecting. Because in my experience, cases that involve humiliation rarely stay simple legal matters. They become psychological battles. Michael Reeves turned slightly toward the defendant before speaking. Your Honor, the defendant's behavior shows a consistent pattern of targeted ridicule. It escalated after she posted a video mocking a judge's manner of speaking, specifically imitating accent and tone in a degrading manner. At that exact moment, I saw something shift in Karen's expression. Not fear, not regret, but irritation, a subtle tightening of the jaw. And I made a mental note of it immediately because juries often miss this detail. Defensive irritation is not always innocence. Sometimes it's ego-resisting exposure. Karen leaned back in her chair and whispered something under her breath. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but I didn't need to. I've seen enough defendants to recognize contempt when it doesn't need volume, the prosecutor continued. And the plaintiff will testify that after this video circulated, the harassment intensified to the point where she had to leave her workplace. That's when I gave the signal. The evidence screen turned on. The courtroom lighting seemed to dim slightly. As it always does when digital truth replaces spoken claims, the video file was cued, and I remember pausing for just a second longer than usual because something about Karen Mitchell's expression changed again. Not fear, not anger, but anticipation, as if she was waiting for this exact moment, and that disturbed me more than anything else so far. The clerk clicked play, and the room went silent. The first second of the video showed Karen laughing on camera, leaning toward a microphone, reenacting a voice, exaggerated, mocking, theatrical, the kind of performance people do when they believe they are safe behind a screen. But then came the part that changed everything. She mimicked the accent of a well-known TV judge, over-exaggerated, sharp, mocking tone layered with sarcasm. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, but what happened next was not in the video, it was in the courtroom, because Karen Mitchell, sitting right in front of me, began to laugh softly, not loudly, just enough for the nearest bailiff to hear. That was the moment I leaned forward slightly. In my experience, laughter during incriminating evidence is rarely confidence, it's provocation. And then I noticed Emily Dawson across the aisle. Her hands had stopped shaking. She was staring at Karen now, completely still. And I remember thinking, this is no longer about a video. Something personal is about to surface. The prosecutor stood ready to continue, but I raised my hand slightly. I wanted to observe Karen's reaction just a few seconds longer, because judges don't just listen to evidence, we watch people react to it, and Karen Mitchell was reacting in a way I had never quite seen before, like she wasn't watching her downfall, like she was waiting for something else to begin, and then it happened. 47 seconds into the video playback, Emily Dawson suddenly stood up, and everything in that courtroom changed in an instant. Emily Dawson rising from her seat was not dramatic at first. No shouting, no sudden outburst, just a quiet, controlled movement, like something inside her had finally reached its limit. But I've learned something over decades on the bench. The most dangerous moments in a courtroom are never loud in the beginning. They start quietly, and then they break reality in half. Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling but sharp enough to cut through the room. She's doing it again. I remember the confusion that followed. Even the prosecutor, Michael Reeves, hesitated for a fraction of a second because what she said didn't match the procedural flow of the case. Doing it again, I asked, keeping my tone steady. Emily didn't sit down. That alone made the jury shift in their seats. Most witnesses understand courtroom discipline instinctively. Standing without permission feels like breaking an invisible rule. But she didn't seem interested in rules anymore. She looked directly at Karen Mitchell, and I saw it immediately. This was not just legal tension. This was personal history resurfacing under pressure. Karen's expression changed slightly, still calm, but now something colder. I warned you, Emily said quietly, almost to herself. I told you not to twist people for entertainment. That word, entertainment, caught my attention because that is usually where defamation cases end on paper, but emotionally, that is where they begin to rot. I leaned back slightly, studying both women, and then I made a decision that I rarely make during active proceedings. I allowed silence, no interruption, no immediate correction, because something about Emily's voice told me the truth here was not fully in the official record yet. Michael Reeves finally spoke up. Your Honor, I would ask the witness to. I raised my hand. Let her speak. The courtroom went still. And that silence, that specific kind of silence, is where real courtroom stories are born. Emily exhaled shakily. Then she said something that I will never forget. It wasn't just that video. A murmur moved through the jury box. Karen shifted slightly in her seat for the first time. Not fear, annoyance, but underneath it. I saw something else, cognition, Emily continued. She didn't just mock a judge. She built her entire content around humiliating people like it was a game. Now, the prosecutor looked up sharply, because that was not in the original complaint. That was expansion. That was emotional testimony, breaking procedural boundaries. But I didn't stop it, because in my experience, when witnesses deviate from script like this, it means the surface-level case is only half the truth. Emily pointed slightly why I'm here. Karen finally spoke. Karen finally spoke. Her voice was calm, almost amused again. I think you're confused, Emily. That was the first time she addressed her directly, and the way she said her name was not casual. It was precise, controlled, like someone pulling a thread they already know leads somewhere dangerous. I noticed the jury immediately react to that tone, not the words, the confidence behind them. That is something I always warn new attorneys about. Confidence is persuasive, even when it is wrong. Emily's hands tightened into fists. No, she said firmly, you're just hoping I won't say it out loud. That sentence changed the temperature in the room. I felt it as clearly as I feel a verdict shift. Michael Reeves turned slightly toward Emily, as if realizing he had lost control of the narrative. Your Honor, I need to clarify. This case is about harassment and defamation related to the defendant's public actions. But I wasn't looking at him anymore. I was watching Karen Mitchell because her reaction had changed again. Now she wasn't smiling. Now she was listening, carefully, like a strategist. And that is when I understood something critical. This was not a simple online harassment case. There was history here that had not been fully disclosed. Emily's voice softened, but became more dangerous. You think I came here because of a video? He laughed once, a broken sound. No, I came here because you made my life a performance. And when I tried to stop you, you doubled it. The courtroom reacted this time. A few whispers. A jury member shifting forward. And I saw something I rarely see so clearly. The jury was no longer neutral. They were emotionally leaning. That is a dangerous moment in any trial, because once emotion enters, logic begins to lose ground. Karen finally leaned forward slightly. And when she spoke this time, her voice was lower, sharper. Careful, she said. You're making claims you can't prove in this courtroom. But Emily didn't flinch. I can prove one thing, she replied immediately. That pause after her words felt like a trigger being pulled without warning. Even I noticed my own attention narrow, because that is the phrase witnesses use right before introducing something unexpected. Michael Reeves stepped forward quickly. Your Honor, I strongly advise, too late. Emily turned toward the evidence screen operator and said, "Play the second file." I did not authorize it immediately. I looked at the prosecutor. He looked confused. That alone told me this was not part of the planned presentation. Then I looked at Karen, and for the first time since the trial began, I saw uncertainty, not fear, but calculation breaking under pressure. I gave a slight nod. Play it. The clerk hesitated for a moment, then clicked, and that moment, that single moment, is where everything in this courtroom began to collapse into something none of us were prepared for. The second file did not begin like evidence. It began like exposure, a shaky phone recording, low lighting, the kind of video that doesn't belong in a formal courtroom setting because it carries too much reality inside it. And the moment it appeared on the screen, I noticed something I will never forget. Karen Mitchell stopped breathing for half a second, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but I've watched thousands of defendants under pressure, and I know exactly what a microfreeze looks like when the brain recognizes danger before the person is ready to admit it. The video played. At first, it showed what looked like a private conversation. Two voices, one of them unmistakably Emily Dawson, but the second voice was Karen, except it wasn't the controlled Karen sitting in front of me. This version of her sounded different, colder, more direct, and far more intentional. "You think people care about you?" the recorded Karen said. A pause, then a soft laugh. People don't care. They just watch. And if they're watching, I make sure they laugh. A ripple went through the courtroom, not loud, but collective, that sound juries make when they realize they are no longer observing a simple case. They are witnessing something personal. Emily stood completely still as the recording continued, and I could see her eyes beginning to water, not from sadness yet, but from the shock of hearing something she had clearly carried alone for a long time. The prosecutor, Michael Reeves, leaned forward immediately. "Your Honor, this was not disclosed in discovery, but I didn't respond yet because I was watching Karen." And this is the part people misunderstand about judges. We don't react to evidence. We react to people reacting to evidence. Karen's jaw tightened. Her fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table, controlled, too controlled. That is never a good sign. The video continued. Emily's voice in the recording was quieter. "You said it was just content, but you posted it with my name." Then Karen's recorded voice responded instantly. That's how you get engagement. And then something shifted in the courtroom because the jury stopped moving completely. Even the smallest gestures froze. I remember thinking, they are no longer thinking about law. They are thinking about intention. The recording ended. Silence followed, not normal silence, heavy silence, the kind that sits on top of people instead of inside them. I turned slightly toward the clerk. "After tape that recording," I said. The prosecutor quickly responded, "We were not given prior access to this file, Your Honor. This was never submitted as evidence. That changed everything procedurally. But emotionally, the damage was already done." I looked at Emily. Her voice was quieter now. "I tried to report it before," she said. "But nobody takes you seriously when it's online, when it's just jokes." That phrase again, just jokes. In my years as a judge, I've learned something disturbing. That is how most reputational harm begins. Not with intent to destroy, but with intent to entertain. Karen finally spoke. Her voice was no longer amused, but it was still controlled. "You edited that." A simple statement, but the jury reacted instantly because now we had contradiction. And contradiction is where doubt is born. Emily shook her head. "No," she said, "you just forgot you were recorded." That line hit harder than anything so far. Even I felt the weight of it, because memory is often the weakest defense against technology. Michael Reeves quickly stepped in again. "Your Honor," I moved to, but I raised my hand, not because I had clarity, but because I needed control back in the room. "Both parties," I said firmly, "sit." They obeyed, but I noticed something important. Karen sat down too quickly, too cleanly, like someone trying to reassert stability. But Emily, she hesitated before sitting, like she was still deciding whether she had already gone too far or not far enough. And that is when I realized we were no longer dealing with a defamation case. We were dealing with a narrative war. And whoever controlled the next piece of evidence would control everything the jury believed. I leaned forward slightly and asked the question that changed the direction of the entire trial. "Is there another recording?" Emily didn't answer immediately, but Karen did for the first time without waiting. "No," she said quickly, too quickly. And in that moment, AB knew she had just made a mistake, because in my courtroom experience, the first person to rush a denial is usually the first person trying to hide what comes next. And Emily Dawson slowly reached into her folder and pulled out something that made the entire courtroom fall completely silent again. Emily Dawson didn't speak immediately. She simply placed the next item on the table, a small USB drive. And I still remember the exact way the courtroom reacted to it, No one gasped, no one moved, but the atmosphere changed as if everyone had collectively understood that whatever came next would not be reversible once it was heard. Even I felt it. That subtle shift judges are trained to recognize when a trial stops being about argument and becomes about revelation. Michael Reeves leaned slightly forward. Your Honor, we were never informed of this evidence. That was the second time he said it. And repetition in a courtroom is never neutral. It signals loss of control. I turned to Emily. Explain. Her voice was steady now, too steady. That worried me more than her earlier emotion. This is the original file, she said. Karen let out a short, almost dismissive laugh. Original? She repeated. You think I don't know what you're doing right now? But there was something different in her tone. The confidence was still there, but it had thinned. Like glass stretched too far. I gave a slight nod to the clerk. Play it. Well, the courtroom lights dimmed again, the screen flickered, and then the video began. This time, it wasn't edited. It wasn't fragmented. It was continuous, a longer recording. And from the very first seconds, I understood why Emily had waited until now. Karen Mitchell appeared on screen again, sitting in what looked like a private room, speaking directly into a camera. But her expression was not performative. It was focused, intentional. You don't understand how this works, the recorded Karen said calmly. People don't engage with kindness. They engage with reaction. A pause, then she leans slightly forward, and she reacts easily. A murmur passed through the jury, not loud, but disturbed. Emily's hands tightened at her sides, but she didn't look away from the screen. The recording continued. I didn't target her, Karen's recorded voice said. I used her. There's a difference. That sentence landed in the room like a physical object. Even the prosecutor stopped moving, and I remember thinking, this is no longer defamation. This is intent. The video showed Karen continuing, completely unbothered. Once you understand attention cycles, you understand people are predictable. You push, they break, and then they give you everything you need. I saw a juror shift uncomfortably. Another looked down. That's the moment I always watch for, when the jury stops evaluating facts and starts evaluating morality. Karen in the courtroom finally spoke. Stop it. Her voice was sharper now, but still controlled. Emily didn't react. She simply said, I didn't record this to hurt you. I recorded it so someone would finally believe me. That word, believe, changed the air again, because belief is not legal evidence, but it is what juries secretly rely on when evidence feels incomplete. The video continued. And then came the part that changed everything. Karen's recorded voice shifted slightly, lower, almost casual. If she ever goes public, I'll just say she misunderstood a joke. That's all it takes. Silence, absolute silence. Even the clerk stopped breathing audibly. I felt the courtroom lock into place, because now we had something far more serious than harassment. We had preemptive framing, bot dent to manipulate perception after harm. Michael Reeves immediately stepped forward. Your Honor, this establishes clear pattern behavior. But I raised my hand again, not because I disagreed, but because I needed to understand how far this went before letting it spill further. I looked at Karen. For the first time, her composure was no longer intact, not fully broken. It cracked, and I've learned something important in my years on the bench. People don't collapse when they are guilty. They collapse when they realize the room has already stopped believing them. Emily finally spoke again. Do you still think this is about a video? Karen didn't answer immediately, and in that pause, I saw something I rarely see, a defendant searching not for denial, for survival, and then she said something unexpected. This isn't everything. The entire courtroom reacted instantly, because that was not a defense. That was a warning, and I remember gripping my pen slightly tighter, because in that moment, AB understood we were standing at the edge of something much larger than any of us had been shown so far. When Karen Mitchell said, this isn't everything, the courtroom didn't react the way people usually imagine. There was no dramatic uproar, no immediate chaos. Instead, a very specific kind of silence fell. The kind that tells you everyone is recalculating the entire case in their mind at the same time. Even I felt it. Because in my experience, defendants do not usually expand the scope of their own exposure unless one of two things is happening. Either they are bluffing or they are preparing the room for something worse that's already inevitable. I leaned forward slightly. My voice stayed controlled. Explain. Karen didn't answer immediately. That hesitation mattered more than anything she could have said. Her eyes shifted briefly, not to Emily, but to the prosecutor. Michael Reeves noticed it too. I saw it in his posture. He straightened slightly, as if bracing for impact. Emily Dawson, however, didn't move. She just watched Karen, like she had already heard this part before and was waiting for the courtroom to catch up. Finally, Karen spoke. You're all acting like you understand what you're looking at, she said slowly, but you don't. That tone again controlled, but now layered with something else, frustration, and something dangerously close to panic hiding underneath it. I've seen that combination before. It usually appears when a person realizes their version of reality is no longer the dominant one in the room. Emily finally broke her silence. Then show them. The way she said it was not emotional, it was almost surgical, like she was no longer participating in the trial, but directing its final phase. Michael Reeves turned toward her sharply. Your Honor, I must object to any further surprise evidence. This violates procedural fairness. And he was correct. But fairness is one of those concepts that becomes complicated when truth appears late in a courtroom. I held my hand up. Proceed cautiously, I said. That was the closest I could come to giving permission without abandoning control. Emily reached into the same folder again, but this time she didn't take out a USB. She took out printed screenshots, dozens of them. And when she placed them on the table, I noticed something immediately. They were not random. They were structured, chronological. That's when I understood this wasn't improvisation. This was preparation. Karen saw them before I did, and I watched her expression tighten, just slightly, but enough. Emily began. She says I misunderstood a joke, she said calmly. But jokes don't follow people across months. She placed the first set of screenshots forward, a comment thread, then another, then a post, all linked, all pointing toward the same pattern. Terroting, escalation, public repetition. Each time Emily spoke, her voice became steadier, not emotional, but increasingly certain. I looked at Michael Reeves, even he was no longer interrupting. That told me everything I needed to know about how strong this chain of evidence looked in real time. Karen finally spoke again. You curated that, she said. But this time, her voice lacked conviction, not fully broken, but no longer sharp enough to dominate the room. Emily nodded slightly. Yes, she said. I organized what you did. That distinction mattered, and I saw the jury react immediately because juries understand patterns more easily than isolated claims. Emily continued. You didn't just mock people online. You built a system where reacting to you was the point. That sentence shifted the atmosphere again. I noticed one juror lean forward slightly, another stopped writing. That is what I call the attention inversion point. When the jury stops tracking events and starts tracking behavior, Karen suddenly exhaled a controlled breath, but heavier than before. Then she said something I did not expect. I never said I was innocent. The room reacted instantly. Even I felt the tension sharpen, because that statement changes everything. It is not denial, it is repositioning. Emily froze slightly. Michael Reeves straightened again, and I felt the entire courtroom tilt forward psychologically, Karen continued. I said, you don't understand the full context. I remember studying her face very carefully at that moment, because now she wasn't defending herself in the traditional sense. She was trying to reframe the narrative entirely. And in my experience, people only attempt that when they believe there is still a missing piece strong enough to matter. Emily whispered, almost to herself, there it is. I looked at her. What did you say? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed one final screenshot on the table. And when I saw it clearly, AP understood why this case had been leading here from the very beginning. Because it wasn't just about mocking an accent. It wasn't just about online humiliation. It was about something far more deliberate, a coordinated pattern tied to something no one had yet said out loud in this courtroom. I leaned back slightly. And for the first time in this entire trial, AB felt something I rarely allow myself to feel on the bench, concern about what comes next. And then Emily Dawson looked at me directly and said, Your Honor, ask her about the account she used when she thought no one was watching. Karen's face changed instantly, not anger, not denial, but recognition. That's when I realized we were finally about to uncover the part of this case that someone had tried very hard to keep buried. When Emily Dawson said, ask her about the account she used when she thought no one was watching, the courtroom changed in a way I cannot describe as anything other than immediate psychological fracture. It wasn't noise. It wasn't reaction. It was recognition spreading through people who didn't yet know what they were recognizing. I turned my gaze slowly toward Karen Mitchell, and I saw it, that brief, involuntary tightening in her posture, not fear in its simplest form, something more precise, exposure awareness. In my years as a judge, I've learned this distinction very carefully. Fear reacts to consequences, but exposure reacts to truth becoming visible. And Karen was reacting to visibility. I leaned forward slightly. Explain what she is referring to, I said. My voice remained controlled, but I allowed it to carry weight. Karen exhaled slowly. Too slowly, as if buying time to construct a version of reality that could still hold together under pressure. I don't know what she's talking about, she said, but there was a problem, and I noticed it immediately. Her denial came too cleanly. No friction. No emotional anchoring, just a sentence placed carefully into the air. That is not how truth behaves under stress. Emily shook her head slightly. You always say that first, she replied, then you switch accounts. A murmur moved through the jury box, not loud, but sharp enough that I saw multiple heads turn toward the screen as if it might confirm something on its own. Michael Reeves finally stepped in. Your Honor, if there is an allegation of multiple accounts being used for harassment, we are now entering digital attribution territory. That requires forensic verification. He was right again, but I didn't stop Emily because the courtroom was no longer operating in clean procedural lanes. We were already inside something deeper. And sometimes a judge must decide whether to preserve structure or uncover truth before structure becomes irrelevant. I turned slightly. Proceed, I said. Emily nodded once and placed a final set of documents on the table, but this time they were not screenshots. They were metadata summaries, account logs, digital fingerprints, the kind of evidence that doesn't argue, it simply exists. Karen's eyes followed the papers before anyone else could read them, and I saw it. A shift in her breathing, barely noticeable, but undeniable. Emily spoke calmly. This is the secondary account you used, she said, the one you never attached to your name. She looked up. And this is where you stop joking. The words landed heavily because the implication was not humor anymore. It was intent operating under separation. Michael Reeves leaned toward me. This is highly technical evidence, Your Honor. We need expert testimony before any inference is made. But I didn't respond immediately because I was watching Karen. And for the first time in this entire trial, her composure was no longer negotiating with the room. It was negotiating with itself. She finally spoke. This is taken out of context, but even she seemed to realize mid-sentence how insufficient that sounded now. Emily didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You said that already, she replied, when I confronted you the first time, and the second, and the third. That pattern mattered. I could feel the jury understanding it without being told. Repetition creates credibility in reverse. The more often a defense repeats itself, the less persuasive it becomes. Karen suddenly leaned forward, and for the first time, her voice sharpened. You wanted attention, she said directly to Emily. That's what this is. You're turning your own engagement into a lawsuit. The courtroom reacted again, but this time I noticed something different. Less sympathy toward Karen, more scrutiny. That is a dangerous shift for any defendant because juries forgive mistakes. But they rarely forgive what feels like manipulation of perception in real time. Emily's expression didn't change. You're still doing it, she said quietly, and I realized she wasn't arguing anymore. She was documenting behavior. Michael Reeves opened his mouth again, but stopped because the screen operator had already begun scrolling through the logs Emily submitted, and that's when the room saw it. A timeline, not accusations, not opinions, a sequence, multiple posts, multiple identities. The same phrasing patterns, same targeting behavior, same escalation cycle. I saw one juror lean back slightly, another rubbed their forehead. That's the moment I recognize as cognitive overload, when evidence stops being debated and starts being absorbed. Karen's voice dropped. This is not what it looks like. But even she didn't sound certain anymore. And I remember thinking something I rarely allow myself to think in court. We are no longer discovering guilt or innocence. We are discovering how long the truth was hidden in plain sight. Emily took a step forward and said something that I knew would change everything if the jury fully understood it. You didn't just target me, she said. You tested how far you could go before anyone believed me. A silence followed, deep, heavy, final seeming, and I saw Karen Mitchell look at the jury for the first time in a way she hadn't before, not as observers, but as judges. And I realized in that exact moment, she understood something irreversible had already begun, and then she said the words that shifted everything again. I didn't expect you to find that account. When Karen Mitchell said, I didn't expect you to find that account, the courtroom didn't explode, it tightened. There's a difference I've learned over years on the bench. Explosions are emotional. Tightening is psychological. It means the room has stopped reacting and started processing consequences in real time. I remember distinctly how my grip on the pen slowed, not because I was uncertain, but because the case had just crossed a threshold where everything said afterward would either confirm intent or attempt to disguise it. Karen realized it too. I saw it in her eyes. That brief moment where control and exposure overlap and one begins to collapse. Emily Dawson didn't move. She didn't need to. Her silence now had weight. Michael Reeves stepped forward immediately. Your Honor, this statement alone suggests prior knowledge of concealed digital behavior. We request clarification on intent and scope, but I raised my hand slightly, not to stop him, but to slow everything down. Because when a defendant admits surprise at discovery, it often opens a path to something deeper than the current charge. I looked directly at Karen. Answer the question, I said calmly. What account are we discussing? Karen hailed longer this time, and I noticed something subtle in her posture, not collapse, but recalibration, like someone trying to reposition themselves within a structure that is no longer stable. Finally, she spoke. I used it to separate things. A carefully chosen phrase, separation, is never neutral in cases like this. It implies awareness. It implies intention. Emily finally broke her stillness. You didn't separate things, she said quietly. You hid them. That single correction changed the emotional alignment of the courtroom again, because juries understand the difference instinctively. Separation sounds administrative. Hiding sounds deliberate. Karen turned slightly toward her. And you kept every message, she said, every screenshot, every comment. You waited. There was something almost accusatory in her tone now, as if she was trying to pull the jury back towards shared blame, but I noticed it wasn't working the way she intended. The jury wasn't leaning towards sympathy. They were leaning towards sequence, and sequence is dangerous for defendants. Emily nodded slowly. Yes, she said. I documented what was happening to me. A pause. Then she added, because every time I tried to explain it without proof, I was called dramatic. That word landed differently. Dramatic, I've heard it in hundreds of cases. It is one of the most effective ways to neutralize a victim before they even reach a courtroom. Michael Reeves spoke again, quieter now. Your Honor, if this pattern is verified, we may be dealing with sustained harassment across multiple identities and platforms. This escalates the case significantly. I didn't respond immediately because I was still watching Karen, and she was no longer fully anchored to her earlier confidence, not broken, but unstable. The most dangerous phase for any defendant is not collapse. It is adjustment under pressure. She finally spoke again. You all think you understand what happened, she said, but you're only seeing fragments. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. Then give us the missing one, she replied. That exchange shifted something in the room again, because now both sides were no longer arguing facts. They were competing over completeness, and completeness is what juries unknowingly seek most. I leaned forward slightly. Is there more? I asked. That has not been presented. Karen didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation, again, told me more than any statement could. Emily looked at her, not angry now, not emotional, just steady, and said, you told me once that nobody would ever connect everything back to you. That sentence changed Karen's expression instantly, a flicker, a recognition she couldn't fully suppress, and I saw it clearly now. This wasn't just about evidence anymore. This was about a belief system Karen had built around control, and that belief system was now failing in real time. Michael Reeves leaned slightly toward me again. Your Honor, I believe we are approaching disclosure that was never part of discovery. But I already knew that. The courtroom knew it too. Even the jury was now sitting differently, no longer passive, engaged, out waiting, and that waiting always signals the same thing in my experience. They believe the next revelation will define everything. Emily reached slowly into her folder again, but this time she didn't pull out documents. She pulled out a single printed page and placed it in front of me. I glanced down, and I felt something I rarely feel during a live proceeding. A pause in interpretation. Because what I was looking at was not commentary, not accusation, but confirmation of a separate identity structure tied to the defendant, multiple accounts, coordinated posting behavior, cross-platform activity logs, and a pattern that extended far beyond what had been described so far in this courtroom. I looked up slowly, and for the first time AB understood why Emily had waited this long to reveal it, because this wasn't just escalation, this was construction. And Karen Mitchell, sitting only a few feet away from me, finally said something under her breath that only I caught clearly. You weren't supposed to see that. The courtroom didn't hear it, but I did. And in that moment, AB knew we were standing right before the part of the story that would define everything that had come before it. Karen Mitchell's voice didn't rise. That's what made it dangerous. I never thought it would reach this point, she said quietly. And for the first time in this entire trial, the confidence in her tone had fully fractured, not into panic, not into emotion, but into something far more revealing. Realization the courtroom didn't move. Even the jury seemed afraid that any sound might interrupt whatever truth was about to surface. Emily Dawson stood still, watching her, not celebrating, not reacting, just waiting, like someone who already knew the ending and was only letting it arrive at its own pace. Leaned forward slightly. Mr. Mitchell, I said, this is your final opportunity to clarify the scope of what has been introduced. Karen exhaled slowly, and then she did something I did not expect. She laughed, but not the earlier confident, dismissive kind. This one was empty, almost tired. I didn't think she kept going after I stopped posting, she said. The words landed in a way that immediately changed the temperature of the room again, because that sentence wasn't defense. It was confirmation of continuity. Michael Reeves stepped forward sharply. Your Honor, this establishes sustained conduct beyond what was initially disclosed. But I didn't look at him. I was watching Karen, because now she was no longer trying to win the room. She was trying to explain it to herself. Emily finally spoke. You didn't stop, she said. You just changed accounts. Karen didn't deny it. That silence was louder than anything she had said so far, and I felt it. The jury felt it too. A shift from uncertainty into alignment. That is the moment every courtroom approaches carefully, because once a jury starts internally agreeing, reversal becomes nearly impossible. Karen finally looked at Emily directly, and what I saw in her face was not anger anymore. It was something colder, smaller. I thought it was just engagement, she said. A pause, then she added, I didn't think it was building into this. Emily shook her head slowly. No, she said. You trained yourself to think it was just engagement. That distinction mattered. And I saw the jury absorb it instantly, because intention versus normalization is where modern digital cases often collapse. Michael Reeves spoke again, quieter now. Your Honor, I request a full forensic audit of all associated accounts and devices. This goes beyond civil harassment parameters. I nodded slightly, but I wasn't focused on procedure anymore. I was focused on Karen, because she had just done something critical. She had stopped resisting the narrative entirely. And in my experience, that is never the end of denial. It is the beginning of admission in fragments. Emily reached for the final document, but before she could speak, Karen interrupted not loudly, but firmly. I didn't expect it to follow me into a courtroom. Silence. Complete silence. And I remember feeling the weight of that statement settle across the entire room, because it revealed something deeper than the case itself. It revealed expectation. And expectation implies awareness of consequence long before accountability arrives. I spoke slowly. Explain what you mean. Karen looked down, then back up, and for the first time, her voice was no longer performative in any sense. It wasn't supposed to be connected, she said. Emily's expression tightened slightly. Nothing is ever unconnected, she replied. And that's when it happened. Karen exhaled again and said the words that finally broke the courtroom's psychological balance. I didn't think she would save everything I deleted. A ripple went through the jury, not loud, but absolute, because that sentence reframed everything, not as accusation, not as interpretation, but as acknowledgement of destruction attempts. Michael Reeves didn't even wait this time. Your Honor, we are now dealing with potential spoliation of evidence and intentional concealment patterns across multiple platforms. But I was no longer listening to him. I was watching Emily, and she wasn't surprised, not even slightly, which meant this moment had been expected. She finally spoke. That's the difference between us, she said. You forgot what you did. I didn't. Karen's shoulders lowered slightly, not defeat, but collapse of resistance, and I realized something I will never forget from this case. The real courtroom battle had already ended before the evidence was even fully shown. We were only now watching the final acknowledgement of it. I leaned back, and for the first time in this trial, AB understood the full shape of what I had been presiding over. A controlled pattern of digital targeting, a sustained behavioral escalation, and a defendant who had never believed it would ever fully converge in one place. Until now, I gave a slow nod. Court will adjourn for recess before ruling on admissibility and further forensic review. I struck the gavel, but even as I did, AB could feel Karen's final words still hanging in the air, not as defense, not as denial, but as something far more unsettling. Truth arriving too late to change consequence, but just in time to define it. And I knew then final judgment in this case would not just be about what was proven, it would be about what was finally understood. When court reconvened, the room felt different, not louder, not more crowded, just heavier, the kind of weight that builds when everyone inside a space understands the outcome is no longer uncertain, only unfinished. I've presided over cases where the verdict was obvious long before I spoke it, but this one was different, because what I had to deliver was not just a ruling. It was an acknowledgement of what had already been revealed in fragments across every testimony, every silence, every piece of digital evidence. Karen Mitchell stood when I entered, but this time, she didn't look at the jury first. She looked at the table as if avoiding the room might somehow delay what was already decided. Emily Dawson sat quietly, still composed, but I could see it now, not anger, not fear, relief, not because she had won something, but because she had finally been believed in a system that rarely believes quickly. Michael Reeves stood ready, but he didn't speak immediately. Even he seemed to understand that this moment belonged to the court alone now. I opened the file in front of me, and for a few seconds, I didn't speak, because judges are often expected to deliver rulings as conclusions, but sometimes they are simply confirming what the room has already accepted. I looked up. This court has reviewed all submitted digital evidence, testimonial statements, and forensic summaries regarding the defendant's conduct. A pause, no movement, not even pens. I continued. The pattern presented demonstrates sustained, coordinated online harassment behavior involving multiple digital identities, repeated targeting of the plaintiff, and intentional concealment of activity. Karen closed her eyes briefly, not dramatically, just that's long enough to feel the sentence land. I went on. This court does not accept the characterization of these actions as isolated or misunderstood communication. That part mattered because it removed ambiguity, and ambiguity is often the last refuge of denial. I shifted slightly. Intent has been established through behavioral repetition, digital correlation, and post-action framing attempts documented in the record. Emily exhaled slowly for the first time, not relief yet, but release of tension she had been carrying for far too long. I looked directly at Karen, and my tone lowered slightly. Ms. Mitchell, you did not simply post content, a pause. You constructed narratives around individuals and then attempted to control how those narratives would be perceived after harm occurred. The room tightened again because that statement removed the final layer of distance between action and consequence. Karen finally spoke. Her voice was quiet. I didn't think it would go this far, and I remember that sentence clearly because I've heard it in many forms, but in this case, didn't function as defense. I nodded slightly, and yet it did. Silence again. Then I continued. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Emily Dawson. The words did not create chaos. They created stillness. A different kind of ending, the kind where nothing more needs to be argued. Emily didn't react immediately. She simply lowered her head slightly as if absorbing something she had carried for far too long. Finally being set down, Karen remained standing. But now, her posture had changed, not broken, but finally still, like someone no longer negotiating with reality. I gave a final look across the room. In light of the evidence presented, sanctions will include damages, mandatory digital accountability review, and restrictions on future platform engagement pending compliance review. The clerk began recording, but I wasn't finished because verdicts are not only legal conclusions, they are reflections of consequence. I leaned forward slightly and spoke in a lower tone than before. That this court record something important. The room quieted further. In the modern age, harm does not always look physical, but its impact is no less real when it is repeated, amplified, and disguised as entertainment. A pause. I looked at Karen. And accountability does not erase the past. It only ensures it is no longer repeated in silence. Then I turned slightly toward Emily, and it acknowledges what was ignored for too long. Emily finally looked up, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression that wasn't survival. It was closure. I struck the gavel once. Court is adjourned. The sound echoed longer than usual. And as people began to stand, as papers moved, as the room slowly returned to noise, AP remained seated for a moment longer because judges rarely speak about what stays with them after cases end, but this one stayed not because of the evidence, but because of how long truth can exist unnoticed before it finally becomes undeniable. And as Karen Mitchell was led away and Emily Dawson remained seated just a moment longer than everyone else, AP realized something I will not forget. Justice is not always loud when it arrives. Sometimes it simply ends the silence that allowed harm to continue, and that is the part of this case I still think about even now, court adjourned.